This is the stadium where Zinedine Zidane became a French national hero during the 1998 World Cup. The son of a poor Algerian immigrant, Zidane represented what many people like to describe as an integrated society. Last week, 3 men approached the stadium with explosives wrapped around their bodies. Near the entrance, they detonated their vests, beginning a night of carnage across Paris, as 80,000 spectators watched 2 old enemies face each other in a friendly inside the stadium. 17 years after Zidane's reign here, the Muslim community say things are looking bleak. Is the far right about to exploit the events of last week? How will the attacks affect France's sizable Muslim population? And what indeed do they think of those changes that lie ahead? This is Barbès, a neighbourhood in Paris that's home to a vast community of North African immigrants and their families. Kamal Sheb has been living and working in Paris since the 1970s. He was born in Tunisia, but has lived here since he was 2 years old. And when I ask him whether he identifies himself as Tunisian or French, he answers simply half-half.
Parce que pourquoi? Parce que j'ai grandi ici, j'ai fait l'école ici. Tous mes amis, j'ai plein d'amis des Français, des Espagnols, des Portugais, j'ai grandi avec eux depuis la maternelle. Et ça veut dire que ma vie c'est en France, quoi. Mes enfants ils sont nés en France, tout est français. J'ai rien d'autre. Bon, c'est vrai, je suis tunisien, je suis musulman, mais voilà, quoi, je suis français et puis voilà, je paye mes impôts ici, ma vie elle est ici, quoi.
Like many of his neighbours in Barbès, Kamal has just started to get back to business after a frightful weekend.
Et c'est là qu'on a appris ça et vraiment c'est impitoyable, quoi. Franchement, on n'a jamais vu ça à Paris et là depuis c'est catastrophique, quoi.
It was a night that brought horror to a city still reeling from another attack at the start of the year. 8 individuals armed with explosive vests and Kalashnikov-type rifles killed 129 people in 3 coordinated attacks across Paris. As Parisians come out to remember those who died, one community seems to be absent. France has a sizable population of Muslims made up mainly of North African immigrants and their families. Muslims account for over 7% of the French population, and many of those in Paris live in Barbès and Belleville. The morning after the attack, they wake up to these front pages. French security, international journalists and the rest of the world attempt to piece together what happened, and blame has already started to go around. Some claim that, quote, terrorists had infiltrated among refugees entering the country. Others speak of foreign passports being found on the attackers' bodies: Egyptians, Syrians, Belgians. By the time ISIS claimed responsibility on Saturday afternoon, the city's Muslim community braces itself for a backlash.
Surtout pour notre commerce, tout ça, franchement, je sais pas comment où on va, mais on est stigmatisé maintenant.
It's certainly not the first time we've witnessed this fear. After the offices of a French satirical publication were attacked in January, millions of people marched in solidarity with the victims. But the country's Muslim population largely stayed away from the rally. Controversy over Charlie Hebdo's anti-Islam cartoons has long taunted the community. But for even longer, there's been another matter that experts say remains unresolved. It's difficult to understand the consequences of last week's attacks without exploring the Algerian War of Independence and the legacy of French colonial rule in Africa. This is Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal. France established a trade port here as early as 1659. Their participation in the transatlantic slave trade was arguably less significant than other European countries, but their drive to control the Senegal River area and its hinterland would mean that in time, West Africa became a part of France, or as colonialists at the time wrote, mere provinces overseas. Even as recently as 100 years ago, France controlled most of their colonial territory in West Africa, from Senegal in the west to the furthest tip of Niger, and from Mali in the north to the southern borders of the Ivory Coast. Hungry to satisfy their commercial interests, the French largely neglected the lives of West Africans, making few attempts to provide minimal health and education services. The French never tried to assimilate West Africans, instead choosing to control the populations using harsh measures like slavery and imprisonment, while increasing their own economic footholds. And if colonialism was gruesome, the fight for independence was to be worse. 1.5 million Muslims were killed during the Algerian War for Independence. Hundreds of thousands were tortured, some hanged from trees. Even right here in Paris, under the elaborate Eiffel Tower or the gleaming museums, lies a gruesome history the French rarely ever mention. More than 200 Algerians were killed by French police in Paris in October 1961. Some were thrown into the River Seine, where they were left to drown. Thousands of others were held at sports arenas, where they were tortured by being forced to drink bleach.
Paris is full of places, full of ghosts and memories that are not recognized. I mean, if you go there with a foreign eye, you won't see that here there was a FLN militant who has been killed by the police, that here there was a peaceful demonstration in which the police just shot at the crowd indiscriminately and hundreds of people died. And you won't see that. You don't see the remnant of that colonial past in France.
When we visited Paris in January following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we tried to speak with the residents of Barbès. We found them to be reclusive and unwilling to engage with the media. Those that did speak to us maintained a uniform response that they felt as much Parisian as they did their native Algerian, Moroccan or Tunisian. But today, as the country mourns its dead, few Muslims are seen visiting vigils at Charonne or the Bataclan Theatre, perhaps symbolising that divisions between these communities run deep. A Muslim man attempts to pay his respects, but finds himself thronged by a crowd of antagonised residents, demanding an explanation from within his faith.
Déjà dans l'islam, regardez, l'islam, vous voyez ce que je veux dire. Regardez, on croit Dieu, on croit pas Dieu. Ouais, il y a des, écoute-moi, il y a beaucoup de musulmans, malheureusement, ils n'ont pas étudié l'islam. Alors les non-musulmans, ils ne connaissent pas l'islam du tout. Donc ces gens-là qui ont fait ça, on appelle ça, laisse-moi parler, on appelle ça, ils existaient à l'époque du prophète. Al-Khawarij, les sortants de l'islam, on appelle ça.
Vous savez, quand il y a de Français, c'est trop tard déjà.
Mais qu'est-ce que tu parles?
C'est-à-dire,
qu'est-ce que tu viens ouvrir ta bouche?
Faites-le aujourd'hui et vous êtes déjà en retard, monsieur.
C'est vrai, on va le faire. Je suis d'accord avec vous, monsieur.
L'idéal serait que les Juifs de France les accompagnent.
Mais pas avec les Juifs, moi je descends avec eux.
Non, mais
moi je suis athée.
Entre autres.
Je suis athée. Je ne comprends pas, je suis athée. Mais je descends avec tous les gens qui veulent vivre ensemble, tout simplement. Tout simplement.
In northern France, a peaceful demonstration is interrupted by right-wing protesters, who organisers say are from the far-right National Front group. Chanting phrases like "oust the Muslims" and "throw out Islamists," the group sets off firecrackers, sending fear down the otherwise restive rally.
La France et les Français ne sont plus en sécurité.
It comes after the National Front leader declared that the French people are, quote, no longer safe. In her tweets following Friday's attack, Marine Le Pen called on France to retake control of its borders. Outside the Stade de France, local residents say they fear the National Front and its growing popularity, but also the government's promise of domestic crackdowns and the waves of bigoted sentiments that have spread into their workplaces.
Il y a en tout cas sur les réseaux sociaux, etc., il y a des réactions un peu hostiles vis-à-vis des musulmans. Après, il faut bien qu'on comprenne que ça n'a rien à voir avec nous, enfin avec la communauté, que c'est vraiment des personnes perdues, si je peux dire.
معناتها اللي يوسخوا الإسلام بطريقة كبيرة، ومعناتها احنا كمسلمين معناتها بصفة عامة ولينا حاجة متاع إرهاب، متاع قتل، متاع اللي هو ماهوش صحيح، معناتها ماهوش بتاعنا أصلا. ومعناتها حتى علاقتنا مع الناس الأخرى ولات حاجة صعيبة، معناتها ما يحبوناش.
بالنسبه لي هذا الوضع هذا تيخوفني انايا وتيخوف العائله ديالي، بالحقاش عندي وليدات ديالي، عندي المراه ديالي.
Observers note a difference in the way French society reacted to the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the responses now. Whereas in January there were calls for solidarity with the Muslim community and differentiation between Islam and those who practice it, all that seems to now be void. Instead, as the New York Times notes, there's a largely unspoken but nevertheless clear stance in which secular France has always had a complicated relationship with its Muslim community. The paper describes it as being tipping towards outright distrust and even hostility.
قبل كانوا تيشوفوا فينا حنايا الجاليات المغربيه والجاليات التونسيه والجاليات الجزائريه بكل عامه اننا حنايا عندنا واحد النبع ديال الارهاب وديال الجهاد، وما منساوش من يامات ديال فرنسا الاستقلال ديالها والاستعمار ديالها في البلدان ديال العرب، باننا حنايا شعب مجاهد، وهم ملي جينا حنايا هنايا لفرنسا ولاو تيشوفوا لنا باننا شعب ديال جاي ماشي فرنسيين، مي شعب من ولاد المجاهدين ديال دوك الناس ديال فرنسا.
لو لوندوما ولاو يتكلموا على الناسيوناليتي وعلى لي زيترونجي اللي هما احنا معناتها بصفه عامه العرب ولي زافريكان، فهمت؟ ولاو يتكلموا على يحبوا ينحيوا لي ناسيوناليتي، يمنعوا لنا الناسيوناليتي، يحبوا ينحيوا لي زيترونجي، يحبوا يخرجوهم من فرنسا، فهمت؟ والله اعلم شنو معناتها وين يحبوا يوصلوا معانا بالضبط، فهمت؟ فوالا معناتها اون ديغي مسرحيه وحاضره، معناتها لو لوندوما ديريكت خرجوا معناتها ولاو يتكلموا على المسلمين وعلى شنو، ويحبوا يمنعوا المسلمين من فرنسا ويحبوا يخرجوا المسلمين من فرنسا. وحتى في الخدم عندنا مشكله، مثلا انا مسلم وواحد مش مسلم، هو يخدم انا ما نخدمش، فهمت؟ ولات حاجه معناتها حاجه تقلق، حاجه تعب، فهمت؟ الى الله محمد رسول الله.
On est touché comme tout le monde. Je vois pas pourquoi cette communauté en particulier doit avoir une certaine réaction ou plus de retenue. Enfin, je sais pas. Après, c'est vrai que je peux comprendre quand on connaît pas qu'on ait peur, vu ce qu'on voit à la télé, etc. Mais non, ça n'a rien à voir. Je pense pas.
At the Omar ibn al-Khattab mosque in the heart of Bellevue, we're stopped from filming. Worshippers arriving for Maghrib prayer hugely distrust the media, and after waiting an hour and a half for a meeting with the Imam, I'm handed a statement condemning the attacks. The mosque has been accused of not doing enough to curb violence, and outside, two women passing by separately stopped to tell me that several, quote, terrorists had worshipped here. The mosque maintains that it's a peaceful place for worshippers to practice Islam and that it's not tried to interfere in domestic politics. I asked the Imam for an interview to talk about fears in the Muslim community and also the suggestion that something needs to be done about the way mosques operate in France. My request was met with fear and suspicion, and the Imam declined to be interviewed. In a nearby shop, I meet Osama bin Zarouk, a Tunisian who's been living in France for the last 7 years. Osama speaks 7 European languages fluently, a skill that's taken him across the continent before finding home here in Paris. Does he remember the lure of France in the days of Zidane?
طبيعي كنت يعني زيدان خلى ذكريات خالدة في جميع أذهان الفرنسيين. أحسن لاعب في العالم كان، يعني خلى انطباعات جيدة، لكن للأسف يعني مؤسف انه تحدث عمليه كما هذه في ميدان كره قدم اللي هو يضم الناس الكل، يعني رياضه تدعو للسلام تدعو.
In Belleville on Monday, many of the shops don't open for fear of racists. Osama says the feeling is widespread as Muslims, particularly women, find themselves the target of hatred.
ثم ناس خايفين يعني ثم خاصة في المحلات الإسلامية ثم أخوات مثلا يعني متعودين أنهم يخرجوا وحدهم للشغل، ثم أخوات ما جاوش يشتغلوا يخافوا لأنهم بنات ما يقدروش يدافعوا على أرواحهم لو يعني صارت عملية عنف عليهم ولا حاجة.
Does Islam have a future in France? Of course it does. Nearly 5 million Muslims here live according to Islam, attending mosques, eating halal food and campaigning to wear Islamic clothing. It's become part of their French culture and perhaps ironically, it's their contribution to those three ideals that French society claims to be built on: liberty, equality and fraternity. That's not to say that achieving any of these will be easy for Muslims in France. The far right is pressing the government to crack down on the Muslim community, and the French Interior Ministry appears to be giving in to those demands. Already, liberty has been curtailed, and in February this year, France began revoking passports of anyone it suspected of intending to travel to Syria. In Belleville, Osama doesn't think the government has grounds to touch the mosques. It's just not the French thing to do, he says.
لا علاقة له يعني خارج موضوع الإرهاب، يعني ممكن ينجم يكون عنده ناتج سلبي أنه يعني ظهر عدائية النظام الفرنسي ضد الإسلام، ومفروض هي فرنسا يعني بلد لايكي فصلين السياسة على الدين، يعني مش من المعقول انك تعطي يعني تبث قوانين في بالنسبة للناس تنتمي لديانة معينة وناس آخرين لا.
So what of the rise of the far right and calls for Muslims to be ousted from France?
قلة ثقافة، قلة آداب، قلة جهل، ونحن كمسلمين ندعو لهم كما نقولوها بالهداية.
In Barbès, Kamal isn't so sure. For him, the moves aren't new, nor a result of emergency measures in light of violent attacks. Last Friday's events, French military action in Muslim countries, Charlie Hebdo's free rein to offend Islam. These are all the culmination of a lengthy history of division, a series of matters unresolved that have seeped into communities, workplaces and even friendships.
2001, le regard des gens a changé. Depuis les attentats du 11 septembre, tout a changé. C'est plus comme avant. Avant, on était tous solidaires entre juifs, français, arabes. Il n'y avait pas de problème de religion. Mais là, depuis 2001 jusqu'à maintenant, c'est que des problèmes. C'est-à-dire qu'on est vraiment mal vu. Et je vois que vraiment, j'ai des amis à moi, des Français, franchement, ils ne sont plus comme avant, quoi. Ils ont changé, ils ne sont plus la même mentalité qu'avant.
At the beginning of the year, the government pledged to hire 2,600 new personnel and spend an additional €425 million as part of what it called exceptional measures to fight terrorism. The idea was to increase surveillance, especially on the web, and give police more powers to make arrests. And following Friday's attack, the country has stepped up its air raids on Syria, vowing to strike at the heart of ISIS, a move which observers say could prove to be counterproductive, citing civilian casualties. Whatever President Hollande's next moves are to be, he's got a complex nation to consider. As they lay flowers outside the Bataclan Theatre this week, opinions among the French public remain divided.
Je suis plutôt athée, mais je pense que les musulmans sont aussi touchés par ce qui vient de se passer aussi, comme les chrétiens, comme les juifs, comme les autres religions qui ont été vraiment touchés par ça.
Nous avons des amis islamiques, mais ça c'est pas des je sais pas comment dire. Ce sont des terroristes, ce sont pas des gens qui prêchent la paix. Ce sont des gens qui cherchent uniquement la guerre. Voilà. Je peux pas... C'est dur. C'est dur parce qu'en plus de ça, c'était des jeunes. La plupart étaient jeunes, ils venaient pour s'amuser. Excusez-moi.
That's okay, merci.